The aisle smelled of lemon polish and leather. Passengers slid into their seats. Soft nods, pointed smiles, the little rituals that say, "We belong." At the front, a woman in a crisp uniform greeted a returning couple with an easy toss of charm. "Good to have you back, Mr. Raymond." Her eyes warmed. Her hand hovered over a champagne flute with practiced grace. He moved with the slow certainty of someone used to measured steps. Silver at the temples, a light cane more for balance than necessity, a jacket that had seen better winters. His presence carried quiet steadiness. He showed his boarding pass without flourish. When the attendant reached him, the smile thinned. "Ma'am, I'm afraid this area is reserved," she said, clipped. A hush folded over the rows. Someone reached for a magazine, pretending not to listen. A woman 2 rows back tucked her pearls closer and leaned in with a quiet remark. The tone had shifted from welcome to gatekeeping, an invisible line drawn between who belonged and who did not. He did not shrink. He set his bag down, smoothed his jacket, and met the attendant's eyes with calm. "This is my seat," he said, steady. Whispers slid through the cabin. "Maybe a mistake," someone offered, wanting the world to smooth itself back into shape. The younger attendant, palms folded in uncertainty, looked torn, willing to do right, but careful about upsetting the one in command. The couple at the front were already settled. Champagne, napkins, easy conversation. The man with the cane watched, shadows passing over his face yet never breaking his posture. Minutes pulled taut. The lead attendant returned to the aisle, warmth for familiar faces, clipped professionalism for others. When she passed his seat, her heel struck his shin. A tray tilted, water splashed onto his lap. She looked at the wet patch with a sharp edge of accusation. "Watch where you put your feet," she said, loud enough that forks paused. The hush deepened. Some looked puzzled. Others seemed satisfied at a tidy correction. He let the water soak his lap and wiped at it with a napkin, unbothered. "You bumped me," he said plainly. Her face changed then, from irritation to something harder. The calm she wore began to crack. She straightened, hands on the tray like a shield, and closed the space until the aisle felt narrow. Passengers leaned forward, drawn by the pull of a single thread. A whisper floated. "She shouldn't have done that." Another voice muttered, "Just stand up and go back." He did not move. The room tightened around that moment, small and electric. Then she raised her hand. And then, subscribe and tell us in the comments which country you're watching from. If this strikes a chord, pause the video and drop a quick thought below before we continue. For an instant, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Cutlery stilled. Conversations thinned. The attendant's fingers made a motion that snapped the air. Gasps followed, immediate and sharp. A man 2 rows back half rose. The younger attendant clasped her hands to her mouth. The couple at the front froze. Champagne halted in midair. The sound of a hand against skin landed harder than anyone expected. He did not flinch. He remained seated, palms steady on his lap. The movement in his face was small, not the sort of fiery reaction some would expect. He folded the napkin and set it aside as if handling an ordinary inconvenience. Silence rippled into murmurs. Some faces reddened, others averted their eyes, suddenly uncomfortable at the spectacle they had been willing to watch. A woman in a business suit cleared her throat and said, quietly, "That was wrong." Another passenger whispered, "Call the manager." The attendants exchanged looks, one poised to act, the other suddenly uncertain of her authority. The man with the cane watched not with triumph, but with a slow, precise calm that suggested he had expected this moment and had been waiting for it for reasons the cabin could not yet see. He reached for his phone and typed with an economy of motion that made the younger attendant glance again, this time with something like recognition. A soft click in the galley answered the tap of his keys. Words passed across a small screen. A quiet voice spoke a few measured syllables. The mood in the cabin changed. What had been a private assumption in many seats had become an open question. Who had been judged too quickly, and who would answer for it? The answer was moving through the plane now, low, unseen, and about to change everything. The hush after the strike did not dissolve. It hung in the air, stretching across polished seats and polished reputations, daring anyone to be the first to break it. And then it came, not from Thomas, but from those who believed silence was safety. "He probably wandered in here," a man muttered from 2 rows back, his voice low but sharp enough to pierce. The woman beside him didn't correct him. Instead, she adjusted her silk scarf. eyes lingering on Thomas as though weighing whether he had simply lost his way. The lead attendant returned, smile fixed like glass. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass again?" The tone carried politeness on its surface, but every syllable dripped with suspicion. She didn't ask others for proof, only him. Thomas reached into his pocket without hurry. He unfolded the pass, held it steady, and let her read the row and seat number printed clear in black ink. She skimmed it with a flicker of irritation, her eyes narrowing as though the paper itself was lying. "I'll confirm," she said, snapping the pass back into his hand, her fingers brushing away contact as though it burned. The younger attendant, Grace, shifted nearby. She saw the seat number. She knew the truth, yet her voice stayed swallowed, buried under layers of hierarchy. Across the aisle, a businessman lowered his tablet, staring too long, the kind of look that presses a man into a smaller box than he deserves. Behind him, whispers spread like a low current. "Doesn't look like first class. Maybe economy was full, probably tried his luck." Every glance became a verdict. The quiet space of the cabin transformed into something harsher, a courtroom without a judge, where the jury whispered openly, condemning before hearing a word of defense. He sat upright, gaze steady ahead, cane resting neatly by his leg. Not once did he plead. Not once did he attempt to explain. That silence unsettled the passengers more than words ever could. The lead attendant leaned closer, her voice notched tighter. "Sir, if you'll step aside, I'll sort this out." She gestured vaguely toward the back, as though the correct place for him could only exist somewhere else. Thomas didn't move, his eyes, blind with age but not submission, fixed on her with quiet certainty. "My seat is here," he said. No flourish, no anger, just a truth stated like stone. Her lips pressed into a line. She turned on her heel, muttering to herself, but loud enough for others to catch fragments. "Confusion. Mix-up. Shouldn't be here." The whispers flared anew, like dry leaves catching sparks. A woman in pearls leaned toward her husband, voice sliding past the aisle. "You'd think they'd check better at the gate." He nodded, his jaw tight with agreement, as if Thomas's presence among them was a clerical failure rather than a right. The businessman tapped his finger against his armrest, not speaking but staring with a weight meant to shame. A young man across the aisle smirked into his phone, thumb tapping out messages no one could see, the glow of the screen lighting his grin. Still, Thomas remained unmoved. He lifted a napkin, dabbed at the water stain from earlier, folded it once, and placed it neatly on his tray. The simple gesture looked almost regal in its restraint. And yet, restraint was not what the cabin wanted. They wanted apology, deference, acknowledgement of his supposed mistake. Instead, he gave them composure, and that composure made the silence heavier. Grace's eyes darted between her colleague and the man in the seat. Her knuckles whitened around the manifest she carried. She knew the truth but hesitated. She had watched this story unfold too many times before. To speak would be to risk her own standing, and silence, though bitter, seemed safer. The lead attendant returned, cheeks flushed, voice pitched louder than before. "Sir, last chance, this isn't your section." Gasps, whispers, even a stifled laugh rose from behind. The performance was now public, each word sharpened for an audience. But Thomas didn't rise. He didn't shift. He met her eyes, calm as stone. "Check your list," he said, his tone so steady it rattled more than if he had shouted. She froze, just for a heartbeat, as if the words carried weight beyond their syllables. Then she turned sharply away, unwilling to test her own authority against the truth. The cabin pulsed with tension, filled not with noise, but with judgment. And in that weight, one question pressed hardest against the ribs. How long could he hold still against the tide of those who had already decided he did not belong? Have you ever felt invisible in plain sight? Tell me below, because that silence can crush you more than words ever will. And as the whispers grew louder, the cabin did not yet know that the man they questioned was the one person whose presence could decide all their fates. The sound of her heels struck the aisle like a drumbeat. She stopped at his row, standing tall, chin raised, every movement meant to show command. Then, louder than necessary, she declared, "Sir, this section is reserved for our premium passengers. You need to move to your proper seat." Her words carried across the cabin, sharp enough that no one could pretend not to hear. Heads turned. Some passengers leaned forward, curious. Others shifted back, satisfied at the performance unfolding. Thomas lifted his eyes, calm and deliberate. "This is my seat," he replied, his voice steady, Dat refusing to bend to the false authority pressed against him. A murmur spread through the rows. Someone whispered, "He's holding up the flight." Another added, "Probably tried to sneak up here." Each voice chipped at his presence, as though repeating the lie often enough could turn it into truth. Lauren crossed her arms, forcing her authority into the open. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Kindly move so that our actual passengers can settle in." Her emphasis landed heavy on actual. He reached down, slid his boarding pass across the tray table, and left it there. Clear, undeniable. She didn't pick it up. She didn't even look at it. Instead, she smiled thinly, turned to the watching rows and said, "Sometimes mistakes happen at the gate. We'll fix this quickly." The audience of passengers nodded, satisfied to believe in the neatness of her explanation. They saw her confidence and mistook it for truth. Meanwhile, the difference in treatment sharpened like a blade. 2 rows ahead, the Raymonds received champagne poured with a glow of charm. The attendant bent low, offering napkins with grace, laughter bubbling in her voice. Moments later, she breezed past Thomas without even the courtesy of eye contact, tray of drinks deliberately tilted away. The divide was clear. Those deemed worthy were served indulgence, those dismissed were left parched. Thomas asked quietly, "May I have some water?" His request wasn't extravagant, not champagne or fine wine, just water. Lauren paused, lips pressed, then shook her head. "I'll get to you once the others are taken care of." She moved on, not once glancing back. The businessman across the aisle frowned, brow furrowing at the unequal treatment. His tablet remained closed now, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Grace, the younger attendant, lingered a few steps behind. She clutched the manifest in her hands, her lips parting as if to speak. But Lauren's sharp glance cut her off before words could escape. She lowered her eyes, cheeks flushed, retreating into silence. The whispers grew bolder. "If he belongs here, why won't she serve him? He should just move. This is embarrassing." The commentary stung more because it wrapped itself in certainty, while none of them knew the truth. Thomas leaned back, folded his hands neatly over his lap, and waited. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend himself with grand gestures. That stillness unsettled Lauren. She wanted compliance, visible submission, something to prove her performance had worked. His calm denied her that. Her voice rose again, this time sharp enough to cut through clinking glasses. "Sir, you are disrupting my cabin. I am asking you one final time. Move to the back where your assigned seat is." Gasps flickered. Some passengers nodded approval. Others exchanged doubtful glances. The businessman exhaled heavily, muttering, "Something isn't right here." Grace shifted again, steps half forward, then back, trapped between conscience and command. Her hesitation spoke louder than words, and a few passengers caught it, sensing the truth hiding beneath the uniform. Lauren ignored all of it. She squared her shoulders and placed herself directly over Thomas, blocking his view of the aisle. Her voice carried down the cabin. "Either you move on your own, or I'll have security remove you. Those are your options." The silence that followed was taut, strung like wire. Thomas finally lifted his boarding pass again, held it steady in his hand, and said quietly, "This is my seat, and I will remain in it." The words landed with quiet force. No anger, no raised pitch, just the weight of unshakable certainty. That was enough to make the cabin hold its breath. For the first time, Lauren's eyes flickered, a tiny break in her veneer of command. But rather than step back, she chose escalation, convinced that louder meant stronger, that public humiliation would drown the truth she refused to face. What she didn't realize was that each word she sharpened against him was cutting her own authority to pieces. The aisle had grown quieter, the earlier chatter fading into a hush that watched more than it spoke. Even the sound of glasses clinking against trays seemed muted, as though the cabin itself braced for the next strike. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, unhurried. "May I have some water, please?" It was the simplest of requests, one any passenger would expect answered without question. Lauren froze at the end of the row, her tray balanced, her jaw tightening. She turned, eyes sharp, her smile forced into something brittle. "Of course," she said, but the tone betrayed her. Thin, biting. She stepped closer, the tray tilting just slightly. The glasses trembled, crystal catching the overhead lights. Then, with a sudden lurch, the tray slipped forward, and cold water splashed across Thomas's lap, soaking into his slacks, dripping onto the carpeted floor. Gasps rippled instantly. A woman clutched her pearls, The businessman across the aisle sat upright, jaw set. A few passengers, lips curling into smug satisfaction, murmured, "He shouldn't have been here anyway." Lauren's gasp was exaggerated, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, watch where you put your legs," she said, pitching her voice loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Now look at the mess you've caused." Thomas glanced down at the water staining his clothes. He dabbed at it with a napkin, movements unhurried, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. "You walked into me." The stillness that followed was louder than any outburst. Heads turned. Passengers traded looks, some uncomfortable, some impatient, others eager for drama. The line between support and silent approval cut straight through the cabin. She bristled, cheeks flushed. "If you had stayed in your space, this wouldn't have happened." He folded the wet napkin neatly on his tray. No fire in his words, no complaint, just presence. His silence carried weight, and that weight unsettled her more than any shouted protest would have. You could feel it. The thought pressed through the air, like static before lightning. The atmosphere shifted, a tension that needed only a spark. The businessman cleared his throat, his voice carrying into the aisle. That didn't look like his fault. His words were measured, careful, but undeniable. Several passengers turned toward him, some nodding slightly, others frowning at his defense. Lauren shot him a sharp look, dismissive, then pivoted back to Thomas. Her smile was gone now, stripped to irritation. "You're disrupting my service. Do you plan to make this flight difficult for everyone?" Thomas lifted his gaze, steady and calm. "I've asked only for what every passenger receives, respect." A quiet murmur swept through the rows, stronger than before. Some faces softened with recognition, others hardened with resentment. The younger attendant, Grace, stood frozen near the galley, her manifest clutched so tightly the paper bent at its edges. Her lips parted, wanting to speak, but no sound left her throat. Lauren's control was cracking. Her voice, once polished, grew sharper, harder. "If you continue this behavior, I'll have you removed before we even leave the ground." He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned back in his seat, hands folded, and met her stare without hesitation. His calm became defiance, though not in words, only in the refusal to shrink. That refusal rattled her. She expected compliance, expected shame, expected him to back down before her authority. Instead, she found herself fighting against stillness, and it unnerved her in ways she couldn't admit aloud. The businessman shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable," just loud enough to be heard. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls tightened her grip on her glass, eyes darting from Thomas to Lauren, torn between discomfort and disdain. Lauren's cheeks burned, her hand tightening on the tray as though it were a weapon instead of a tool. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she hissed, voice breaking from composure into something sharper, uglier. Thomas said nothing. His silence landed heavier than words. The quiet pressed on her, thick, unbearable. She needed to shatter it. She leaned closer, her whisper harsh enough to cut. "You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you're reminded of that before we take off." The words didn't vanish into the air. They lingered, echoing through the shocked silence of passengers who had heard every syllable. And in that silence, the shift grew. It was no longer just about a man in a seat. It was about what the cabin, the crew, and the witnesses were willing to allow. Lauren, caught between her fury and her role, had pushed herself past the line of professionalism. The stage she had built for humiliation was crumbling, and she didn't yet realize she was standing on the edge of it. The tension no longer asked if it would break. The only question left was when. The argument had sharpened into silence. Every passenger knew they were watching something dangerous unfold, yet no one moved to stop it. Lauren stood over Thomas, her breath quickened, her authority slipping away one word at a time. And then it happened. Her hand flashed, sharp and sudden, striking across his face with a sound that split the cabin wide open. The room froze. Forks halted midway to mouths, champagne flutes trembled in hands. For one stunned second, no one breathed. The crack of her palm against his cheek lived in the silence long after the motion ended. You don't forget the sound of a hand striking dignity. It's louder than thunder. Gasps surged like a wave. "She hit him," someone whispered, horrified. Another voice, sharper, tried to excuse it. He must have provoked her. But it was drowned out by outrage boiling just beneath the hush. Thomas didn't raise his hand. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch back into his seat. He He sat still, face angled slightly where the blow had landed, and then he slowly turned his eyes toward her. Those eyes, calm and steady, unsettled her more than fury ever could. Lauren pulled her hand back, realization flashing across her face. For a moment, even she looked shaken by what she had done. But instead of apology, she doubled down. "You've been disruptive since you stepped on this plane," she announced loudly, using the cabin as her jury. "Maybe now you'll learn there are rules." The businessman across the aisle half rose from his seat, his expression stormy. "Rules? That was assault," he snapped, his voice carrying over the stunned passengers. Several nodded in agreement, murmuring among themselves, while others looked away, unwilling to confront the scene directly. Grace stood frozen near the galley, her hand covering her mouth. Her manifest slipped from her fingers, pages fluttering onto the carpet. She bent to pick them up, but her trembling hands betrayed her. She had seen injustices before, but this was different. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried through the silence like iron. "You've crossed the line." The words cut deeper than any shout could. They were not a threat, not a plea, just a truth, undeniable and final. Lauren tried to mask her falter with a smirk. "You think I'm afraid of you?" His head tilted ever so slightly. "Not yet." The reply sent a ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some whispering in hushed tones. A woman leaned to her neighbor, her voice quivering. "She's in trouble. You can see it." Lauren's face flushed. She had built her authority on performance, on spectacle. But Thomas's stillness, his refusal to give her the reaction she demanded, was dismantling her in front of everyone. She stepped back a fraction, her grip tightening on the edge of the seat beside him. "You're finished," she hissed, but her voice cracked on the last word. Thomas reached for his napkin again, dabbed once at the mark on his cheek. Warren then folded it neatly and placed it on the tray table. His every movement was deliberate, controlled, dignity in motion. The businessman spoke again, louder this time. "We all saw that. Don't pretend you didn't." More murmurs rose. "It's unacceptable." She hit him for nothing. The murmurs spread, no longer whispers, but collective judgment. Grace straightened, her courage flickering through her fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but Lauren shot her a glare sharp enough to silence. Grace shrank back, though her eyes never left Thomas. He leaned back in his seat, calm as ever, his hands resting loosely in his lap. No sign of anger, no sign of defeat. Just composure, unbroken. And that composure was the most dangerous thing in the room, because it told everyone watching that this was not over. Lauren sensed it too. Her chest rose and fell too quickly, her breaths uneven. She glanced down the aisle, searching for someone, anyone to validate her. But the faces that met her gaze were no longer warm. Suspicion lingered where support had been. The silence in the cabin was heavy now, not with compliance but with judgment. And still Thomas sat there, steady as stone, his presence turning every second into her undoing. She had struck him to claim control. Instead, she had lost it. Thomas's cheeks still bore the faint redness of the slap, but his composure never wavered. He lifted his head slowly, his voice steady and low, yet strong enough for everyone around him to hear. "You've just made the worst mistake of your life." The words weren't shouted. They weren't frantic. They settled into the cabin with a quiet weight, like a verdict already decided. Lauren let out a short laugh, brittle and forced. "Is that supposed to scare me?" she asked, tilting her head. "You think a little speech is going to change the rules here? I run this cabin." She looked to the rows of passengers for support, but the room no longer felt like hers. Whispers had started, threading through the aisle. She went too far. He didn't even do anything. That was uncalled for. The businessman across the aisle folded his arms, glaring openly. "You crossed the line," he said, his voice sharp. A few others nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening against her. Still, Lauren pressed on, unwilling to yield. "He was disruptive. I was enforcing order." Her tone rang hollow, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as the crowd. Thomas didn't argue. He didn't rise to meet her fury. Instead, he pulled a phone from his pocket with deliberate slowness, unlocked it, and typed a brief message. His thumb moved unhurried, each tap a quiet statement that unsettled more than any raised voice could. The businessman leaned slightly forward, watching. A woman in pearls whispered to her husband, her earlier disdain replaced by unease. Even those who had been content to see Thomas pushed out were no longer certain of their place in the scene. Lauren's jaw tightened. She gestured toward him with a sharp flick of her hand. You can type all you want. It won't change the fact you don't belong here. But her words cracked at the edges. She could feel the shift in the cabin, see it in the eyes that no longer followed her lead. Grace stood a few rows back, her manifest still clutched against her chest. Her breathing was shallow, her gaze darting between her superior and Thomas. Then, in a decision that seemed to cost her, she turned and slipped quietly into the galley. Passengers tracked her movement. The curtain swayed as she disappeared behind it, phone pressed to her ear. She spoke low, words too quiet to catch, but the urgency was unmistakable. Lauren noticed. Her face darkened, her voice sharp. "Grace," she barked. "Get back here, now." But Grace didn't return. The curtains stilled. Silence hung in its place, a silence that spoke volumes. Thomas rested his phone face down on the armrest, his hand calm atop it. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. That act alone, unbothered, deliberate, let every passenger wonder who might be on the other end of that message. A man in a blazer leaned toward his companion. "He's not just some passenger. Look at the way he's sitting. Look at how calm he is." The murmurs spread further now, no longer hidden. Doubt settled over the rows like a new atmosphere, tilting the balance away from Lauren's authority. She tried to rally, raising her voice, her tone harsh and desperate. "Ladies and gentlemen, please understand there are protocols. This isn't personal, it's procedure." But her words landed flat. They rang false after what everyone had just witnessed. Thomas finally shifted, just enough to fold his hands neatly on his lap. His eyes locked on hers, not hostile, but unshakably steady. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And when you deny it, there are consequences. The line rolled through the cabin like an echo, bouncing off the silence of every passenger now watching her, not him. Lauren swallowed hard. For the first time, she had no quick retort. Her smirk faltered. Her posture stiffened. The performance that had carried her authority was beginning to fracture. The businessman's voice cut the quiet. "Maybe you should take a step back before this goes any further." A ripple of agreement moved through the seats. Even the woman in pearls, who had whispered doubt into her husband's ear earlier, now shifted uncomfortably, eyes lowered as though ashamed. Lauren forced a smile that no longer reached her eyes. She straightened her jacket, tried to regain her composure, and said coldly, "We'll see who faces consequences." But the cabin had already shifted. Allegiances were no longer hers. They belonged to the man who had said almost nothing, yet spoken volumes. The storm was coming, and though Lauren still pretended otherwise, everyone in that plane could feel it gathering just beyond the curtain. Engines hummed beneath the floor, steady as the breath of a giant. The plane had begun to inch toward the runway, the cabin filling with the rhythm of travel about to begin. Passengers settled, straps clicked, glasses tilted. Lauren tried to gather herself, moving briskly down the aisle, fussing with headrests, adjusting trays that didn't need adjusting. Her movements were sharp, mechanical, like someone desperate to reassert control through motions no one asked for. Then, without warning, the engines stilled. The vibration underfoot ceased. The plane stopped. Heads lifted. Eyes met across the cabin. Even the air seemed to shift as silence settled in its place. A moment later, the intercom crackled, and the captain's voice, calm but deliberate, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received instructions from ground control to hold position. We will not be departing until further notice. Thank you for your patience." The words landed heavily. They weren't routine. They weren't the usual apologetic delay over weather or traffic. This sounded formal, deliberate, measured in a way that made people sit straighter in their seats. Lauren froze mid-step. Her hand gripped the top of a seat, knuckles white. She forced a smile, glancing quickly down the aisle, but the unease in her eyes betrayed her. Passengers exchanged whispers. "That's strange. Why would they hold us here?" We were cleared to go. The murmurs were restless, uncertain. Thomas remained still, his phone resting face down on the armrest. He hadn't spoken since his quiet warning, but his presence was louder now than anything else in the cabin. His silence had weight, and it made people look at him differently. Less as a man accused, more as a man waiting for something inevitable. Lauren turned sharply toward Grace, who had slipped back into the galley after her whispered call. "Did you hear that?" she snapped, voice low but edged. Grace didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward Thomas, then back to the manifest in her hands, as though the paper might shield her from the storm she knew was gathering. The businessman leaned across the aisle, speaking just loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "This isn't protocol anymore." His words weren't shouted, but they carried a certainty that others latched onto. Heads nodded. Agreement passed quietly like current through the cabin. Lauren straightened, her posture rigid, and forced a laugh. Delays happen all the time, nothing unusual. But her voice wavered. The polish was gone. Maya's reflection laced through the silence. Unseen machinery had begun to turn. This wasn't weather. This wasn't routine. This was something larger. Something set in motion by the man she had tried to diminish. Passengers knew it too. A woman near the middle leaned toward her husband, whispering, "Do you think it's because of what just happened?" He didn't answer, but the crease in his forehead deepened. The businessman sat back in his seat, arms folded, eyes locked on Lauren. His expression said what his words had already planted. The story had shifted, and she was no longer in control of it. Thomas lifted his hand, not to draw attention but to adjust his sleeve, revealing the watch beneath. Simple, elegant, understated. His movements carried an air of someone not caught in an accident but awaiting a conclusion he already foresaw. Lauren's throat tightened. She spun toward the galley again, hissing, "Grace, explain to the captain that this is just a misunderstanding." But Grace didn't move. She stood with her back straight, eyes lowered, lips pressed into silence. Her defiance was quiet, but it was defiance all the same. The cabin's energy thickened. What had begun as whispers now grew louder, passengers trading theories and low tones. They stopped because of him. She went too far. Someone higher is watching. Lauren snapped her fingers toward Thomas, desperate to reassert dominance. "Put your phone away. You're not allowed to use it while we're grounded." Thomas didn't respond. He didn't even glance at her. He let the phone rest where it was, his stillness a louder rebellion than any argument could be. The captain's voice returned, measured and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Further instructions will follow shortly." This time, no one mistook the weight in his tone. It wasn't a delay. It was intervention. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, watching Lauren now with suspicion instead of trust. Her authority had become fragile, stripped by the silence of the man she'd tried to humiliate, and the voice of a captain who no longer sounded like her ally. The unseen machinery of power had begun to move, and though Lauren still clung to her role, the ground beneath her had already shifted. The plane remained frozen in place, engines idling low, the cabin caught between anticipation and dread. Lauren paced the aisle like a guard patrolling territory, her smile pulled so tightly it looked painful. She adjusted the same headrest twice, tucked away a blanket no one had unfolded, busy work to hide the crack in her command. The curtain rustled at the front galley. Grace stepped back into the cabin, her face pale, her hands shaking as though they still held the weight of a decision. She moved carefully, her eyes fixed on the floor until she reached Thomas's row. Then, leaning close, she whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "They know." Thomas inclined his head slightly, no more than that. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. The faintest curve of calm touched his lips, and then he returned his gaze forward, as though he'd been expecting those words all along. Lauren spotted the exchange, her voice sliced through the cabin, sharper than she intended. "Grace, what are you doing?" The younger attendant stiffened, but instead of shrinking back, she squared her shoulders. She didn't answer. She walked past Lauren, slipping into the jump seat near the galley, buckled herself in, and folded her hands tightly in her lap. Her silence spoke volumes, and the passengers caught it. Whispers churned through the rows. What does she mean? They know? Know what? Who's he really? Lauren tried to overtake the murmurs, raising her voice with false brightness. Ladies and gentlemen, everything is under control. We'll be departing shortly. But the words landed flat, brittle, like porcelain ready to shatter. No one believed her anymore. Then the sound came, the hiss of the cabin door opening. Every head turned. A uniformed compliance officer stepped aboard, his expression neutral, his eyes scanning the space. Behind him, 2 security staff followed, posture upright, movements steady and precise. The cabin's whispers collapsed into silence. Lauren stiffened, her hand flying to smooth her jacket. "Officer, I can explain," she blurted, rushing down the aisle to meet him. "There's been a misunderstanding. One of the passengers?" "Miss Harper," the officer said, addressing her by name, his voice level, authoritative. "We'll need a word." Her eyes widened. She hadn't given him her name. Passengers exchanged looks. realization dawning. Something larger was at play. Lauren stammered. I was simply enforcing protocol. She gestured toward Thomas's seat, her movements frantic now. He doesn't belong here. He's been disruptive since boarding. The officer didn't look at Thomas. Not yet. His gaze remained fixed on Lauren, calm but unyielding. We've received a report regarding your conduct. We'll need you to step aside. Her composure broke. My conduct? I was protecting the integrity of the cabin. This section is for elite. She caught herself, but too late. The word elite hung heavy in the air, dripping with the prejudice she thought she'd concealed. A murmur of disapproval rolled through the passengers. Someone muttered, "She said it out loud." Another voice followed. "This is discrimination, plain as day." The businessman leaned forward, his voice carrying. "We all saw what happened. She hit him. She humiliated him." His words gathered nods, passengers emboldened by the presence of authority no longer in Lauren's hands. Thomas remained seated, still and dignified. His eyes didn't waver, his hands resting calmly on his lap. The officer's glance flickered to him once, then returned to Lauren. "Ma'am, you will accompany us forward. Now." Her face flushed red, panic rising. She turned desperately toward the passengers, as though seeking an ally among those who had watched her performance. But the faces staring back weren't sympathetic anymore. They were cold, judgmental, some even hostile. "Please," she tried again, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. He doesn't belong here." But no one defended her. Not a word. She hesitated, still clinging to the scraps of authority she thought remained. The officer didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated, firmer this time, "Now." And with that, her authority collapsed. She stepped aside, shoulders rigid, eyes darting like a trapped animal. The security staff moved behind her, guiding her toward the galley. The click of her heels against the floor sounded nothing like command anymore. It sounded like retreat. The cabin exhaled. Whispers surged back, this time louder, pointed. "Who is he? Why such a fast response?" He didn't even flinch, like he knew this was coming. Maya's reflection lingered in their thoughts. The unseen machinery of power had turned, and it had turned quickly. Too quickly for an ordinary passenger. Passengers leaned into their suspicions, voices mixing with disbelief and awe. Who exactly was Thomas Caldwell? He sat in the same seat, calm as stone, while the cabin buzzed around him. He hadn't demanded vengeance. He hadn't raised his voice. Yet the entire system had bent within minutes to his quiet dignity. And still, he said nothing. That silence was louder than any revelation. The cabin door opened again, this time, not security, not compliance. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his polished shoes catching the low light of the aisle. His presence carried weight, not just authority, but recognition. Several passengers straightened, as though sensing something far larger had entered the room. Behind him trailed two assistants, clipboards in hand, their pace brisk, purposeful. The suited man scanned the cabin once, then moved directly toward the row where Thomas sat. Lauren froze mid-step, her lips parting as though words might save her. But none came. The executive stopped before Thomas, bowed his head slightly in respect, and spoke loud enough for every passenger to hear. "Mr. Caldwell, I am so sorry you've had to endure this." Gasps tore through the cabin, heads whipped around, eyes widened. "Mr. Caldwell." Passengers repeated it under their breath like an echo spreading through the rows. The man they had whispered about, doubted, dismissed as out of place. "Mr. Caldwell." Recognition began to ripple. A woman near the front pressed her palm against her mouth. "That's Thomas Caldwell?" she whispered to her husband. "The Thomas Caldwell?" The businessman leaned back in his seat, eyebrows raised, his voice low but steady. "He owns the airline." The words struck harder than any slap could have. The billionaire who signed the checks, who built the empire, whose name was stitched into every uniform, engraved on every plane, he was the man sitting quietly in the seat they'd tried to strip away. The shame spread faster than disbelief. Passengers who had muttered about him sneaking in now avoided his gaze, their faces flushed. The woman with pearls dropped her eyes to her lap, cheeks burning. The young man who had smirked into his phone slid it quietly into his pocket, no longer grinning. Lauren's knees seemed to weaken beneath her. She stumbled, catching herself against the nearest headrest. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon drained out of her, leaving only the hollow shell of arrogance. Thomas didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand an audience. He looked at the executive, nodded once, then turned his eyes briefly across the cabin. His words, when they came, were simple, steady, and final. Respect should never be conditional. The sentence landed like a hammer on stone, reverberating through every heart in the cabin. Passengers shifted, shame tightening their throats. They weren't just hearing him, they were being judged by the silence that followed. The executive nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Caldwell. This conduct will not be tolerated. Measures are already being taken." He turned then, his gaze falling on Lauren. The shift in his eyes was enough to make her tremble. She tried to summon her smile, but it collapsed into a twitch. "Sir, Not another word." He cut her off, his tone sharp, final. Her chest heaved, the weight of her arrogance dragging her down. She had slapped dignity itself, and now she stood stripped of everything she thought she controlled. The businessman across the aisle let out a slow breath, shaking his head in disbelief. The murmurs of the other passengers quieted into silence, not out of comfort but from the sting of guilt. They had judged before knowing. They had joined the chorus of whispers, and now every one of them sat beneath the shadow of their own complicity. Grace, still seated near the galley, closed her eyes for a moment, relief softening her features. She had known something was wrong, and now truth had found its way into the open. Lauren's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for sympathy, but none came. The same faces that had once nodded along with her performance now turned away, unwilling to be connected to her downfall. Thomas remained seated, his posture steady, his silence a greater condemnation than rage ever could have been. Respect should never be conditional. The lesson hung in the air, unshakable, undeniable. And for Lauren, the weight of her arrogance had finally crushed her. The cabin never felt the same after that moment. Passengers sat in silence, wrestling with their own guilt. Some stared out the window, pretending to see clouds that weren't there. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, haunted by the things they had whispered only minutes earlier. It was no longer just about one slap. It was about what that slap revealed. Because the slap wasn't simply physical. It was society's arrogance laid bare, a belief so deeply rooted it came out unfiltered, that dignity belonged only to a few, and everyone else had to earn it in the eyes of those holding false authority. She thought she had struck down a man who didn't belong. Instead, she exposed exactly what did not belong, prejudice parading as protocol. Her downfall wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every stare that avoided hers, every whisper of disapproval, every sharp glance from the executive cut deeper than any headline could. She had written her own ending in front of witnesses who would never forget it. And Thomas? He never needed to gloat. He never needed to stand or shout or demand retribution. His silence was enough to convict the entire cabin. His calm was the mirror that forced them all to see themselves more clearly than they wanted to. One sentence was all he left behind for them to carry. Respect should never be conditional. Those words will outlive any announcement, outlast any delay. They will ring in the memory of every passenger on that flight because they weren't simply meant for Lauren. They were meant for all who looked at Thomas and saw less, when in truth, they were looking at the man who had built the very wings carrying them through the sky. She thought she slapped a nobody. She slapped the hand that signed her paycheck. That is the nature of arrogance. It blinds, it belittles, and it destroys itself in the end. The lesson is not just about one flight or one attendant. Racism hides in uniforms. It hides behind rehearsed smiles. It hides in the way water is offered to one passenger and withheld from another. But dignity unmasks it. And when dignity refuses to move, refuses to bow, refuses to be silenced, arrogance collapses under its own weight. The passengers left that plane with more than their luggage. They carried shame, regret, and the quiet knowledge that they had witnessed a reckoning disguised as an everyday flight. Some would talk about it for weeks. Some would try to forget. But none could deny that they had seen what it looks like when truth walks calmly down an aisle and takes its rightful seat. And now, we'll leave you with this. What would you have done if you were on that plane? Would you have spoken up sooner? Would you have stayed silent, waiting to see which way the tide turned? Drop your thoughts below. Share your country flag in the comments so we know where you're watching from. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ because stories like this remind us dignity is priceless.